The conference room was silent, with that tense silence that only repressed, unbridled emotions can produce. The only thing missing from the film's classic Hitchcock-style tension was the ticking of an old clock. Two people sat on one side of the table. The woman had shoulder-length, straw-blonde hair and bright blue eyes that seemed skeptical of everything, even the specks of dust drifting in the rays of sunlight that filtered through the small cracks in the blinds. Her makeup was understated and professional, and paired perfectly with a classic business dress in a combination of black, gray, and white. There was a folder on the table in front of her, and from time to time she glanced at the silent electric clock on the wall opposite. The man was in his early 30s, but he had shabby facial features like those of a person who has aged several years in less than a month. The brown hair was a little long and disheveled, like a lonely man who has no one to remind him to go to the hairdresser. Brown eyes are slightly squinted, and lips are pressed tightly together, like someone who desperately wants to be somewhere else, but is resigned to the pain ahead. Exactly 2 minutes before the appointed time, the door on the opposite side of the room opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man walked in, followed by a woman. He pulled out a chair for her and then sat down himself. The door slowly closed behind them with a heavy click. The man was tall and had an indescribable determination, akin to a Roman gladiator before the gates to the Colosseum opened. His red hair was cut perfectly, and could have been mistaken for a wig. His green eyes were alert, and his gaze seemed to weigh and consider everything and everyone in the room. His gray suit seemed to be carved from stone, because there was not the slightest wrinkle on it. The woman next to him was frail and slender, with long black hair combed strictly back and held in place with a simple, heavy clip. Usually her eyes were a pleasant blue color, but now they were covered with a crazy web of red that spoke of copious tears, shed and not yet shed. She looked like a woman who had not slept well for over a month and was being forced to eat. She was wearing a black dress, the kind you would wear to a funeral. She desperately tried to catch the eye of the man sitting across the table from her, whose eyes were glued to the knot in the faux wood paneling behind her. The tall, broad-shouldered man stood up and extended his hand to the blonde, who stood up and shook his hand. Steve Wheeler. Venus Anderson, she answered, letting go of a strong, confident grip and sitting up, looking at him suspiciously. The grip was neither overly familiar nor intimidatingly firm. He did not openly press his height or obvious advantages in physical strength, but treated her as a fellow gladiator. It was unusual enough to cause a flash of bewilderment, which she quickly dismissed. She opened the folder in front of her, picked up a neatly printed death sentence for marriage, and said, "I hope that you will consider my client's offer more than fair." In fact, she did not need to read the text, since she typed it herself, based on agreements with her client, my grandfather Williams, who sat stoically next to her. She used her best, most reasonable voice, hoping that the pain would start to go away the sooner the stitches were removed. There is little equity in the house, and neither can afford to truly buy the other half or take on the mortgage entirely, so the house must be sold, and any profit or loss divided equally. Each will have their own vehicle and be responsible for their own insurance and other normal expenses. Each party will maintain their own retirement accounts. Any and all savings, checks, stocks, bonds, or other assets must be divided equally. My client is offering maintenance of $1,000 per month for 1 year or until your client remarries or moves in with her significant other. In exchange, your client will return to her maiden name, stop wearing her wedding ring, and return her engagement ring, which is an heirloom from my client's family. Until the divorce is final, your client will have my client's health and dental services. She will be removed from my client's insurance policies upon acceptance of this offer. She looked at the distraught woman, suppressing a fleeting wave of sympathy, and carefully moved the sheets across the table. There is no fairer offer. My client just wants this to end as quickly as possible and hopes that your client will not drag it out. The woman, Jennifer Williams, gasped slightly, bit her lip, and exchanged glances with her lawyer. She nodded curtly and elbowed him on the shoulder. He gave her that little look that said to any seasoned poker player, "Are you really sure about this?" She nodded again. He sighed, barely audible. He turned to his opponent and said, "This is indeed a very fair settlement, and more than my client says she deserves." He reached across the table and pushed the papers aside slightly. "However, she respectfully and hopefully asks your client to consider her counteroffer." He pulled out several sheets of paper from the folder and began to read. The opposing lawyer maintained an air of complete neutrality, while her client looked at the speaker with a look that oscillated wildly between disbelief and outright hostility. "My client will transfer all cohabitation rights to your client. His name will be the only one on the title, deed, and mortgage. She will transfer 100% of all joint assets to your client and will not claim his pension or any other benefits. She will revert to her maiden name, return the engagement ring, but will wear the wedding ring on a necklace in hopes that one day your client will put it on her finger again. Although she quit her job, she does not require any maintenance. She will no longer have any contact or any relationship with her former colleague. She will be looking for a new job, and your client will have the right to deny or allow her to take a new job. Any and all income from said work will be directly deposited into an account over which your client will have full control. Any benefit my client receives will be entirely at your client's discretion. Upon the entry into force of this dissolution of marriage, your client will allow my client to reoccupy her home, her bedroom, and her bed and resume sexual relations with her." She nudged him with her elbow, and he looked at her again. "Frequent sexual relations so that she could make amends to him. In support of this, you will find the attached medical report, which states that she does not have any sexually transmitted infections. She requests couples counseling with your client, having veto power over the choice of counselor with sessions when mutually convenient. She agrees to wear an ankle monitor if your client so desires. She will share all passwords to all of her electronic devices, and agrees that your client will have unrestricted access to all such devices at all times. In case of any future proven infidelity, she will leave with only her car, clothes, and what she owned before marriage. In this case, she voluntarily relinquishes all custody of any future children, and any visitation will be at the discretion of your client. She also agrees that your client may have, at any time in the future, an external sexual relationship of no more than 3 encounters, and my client will not say a word about it or take any negative or harmful action against your client, as she considers it is like a just punishment for allowing lust to overcome love, honor, and common sense. She only asks that you let her know when the meetings are over." He paused, and his client elbowed him sharply again. He cleared his throat and continued, "So that she can prove to him that he will never be able to find a better partner anywhere. She is bitterly aware that she is on the verge of losing the best friend she has ever had." He looked up and moved his papers a few inches towards his colleague. "She already signed it, and your client will probably never receive more complete remorse. Yes, remorse and love." Bob's face had gone from stony to doubtful, to incredulous, to now firmly set on anger. "Damn you, Jennifer, damn you," he muttered through clenched teeth, and barely keeping himself under control, stood up, pushed back his chair, entered one of the small side conference rooms, and slammed the door behind him. None of the rooms were completely soundproof, and the cry of primal frustration was clearly audible, but not deafening. Jennifer began to stand up with the clear intention of following him, but Ms. Anderson was even faster than Mr. Wheeler and leaned across the table, opening her palm up, and said quietly, "Let him figure it out himself." For several minutes, the sounds of banging on walls, kicking furniture, and obscene shouting could be clearly heard in the large conference room, but there was no response to them, as both lawyers avoided looking at each other while Jennifer stared anxiously at the door. Her lips trembled. A little less than 5 minutes later, the stomping and swearing stopped, and intermittent signs were heard. The door opened, as usual. Not with a push, not suddenly swung open, but opened at a normal speed and quite softly. Bob, refusing to look at anything other than the papers on his desk, pulled up his chair, sat down, and pulled the papers towards him. "A pen," he said into space. After a moment of confusion, the lawyer handed him a pen. He quickly began crossing out something in the text and adding something new. "Jennifer must sign all changes, right?" he growled, addressing no one in particular. "Yes. After she already signed, she would need to sign again for any changes," Steve agreed gently. "I hereby withdraw the petition for dissolution of marriage," Bob said through clenched teeth, forcing himself to write slowly and legibly. "Subject to the following conditions. I accept sole ownership of the house, but only until the birth of the first child, after which ownership will be joint. All assets remain joint, but any transaction over $500 other than the deposit will require both signatures. If a co-worker attempts to continue contact of any kind, Jennifer will stop contact, notify me immediately, and we will jointly file for a restraining order. I agree to a consultation, and we will begin the search tomorrow. I accept the punishment for future infidelity, but it will apply to both of us." He raised his eyes and gazed at his wife's tear-stained face, then returned to the document. "How you could be married to me for 3 fucking years and think that I would ever deprive children of their mother is beyond me. Unless there are medical, mental, or physical safety issues to consider, custody of the children should be shared and visitation should be unlimited." He scribbled a little more and then spoke, his voice trembling with tension. He looked up again and barked, "And how could you offer sex for revenge? I have never wanted anyone but you, and there is no way I will agree to this. Did you understand this?" A single groan escaped him, but he managed to swallow it. "You hurt me. You tore my heart out. I didn't think there was so much pain in the world until it happened to me." She sobbed, ran around the table, and threw herself into his arms. Ms. Anderson pulled up a chair to keep it from falling, and the husband and wife curled up in grief and relief, crying in each other's arms and muttering promises, apologies, and threats as their lawyers handed the amended document to each other. As the insistent kissing began, Mr. Wheeler cleared his throat loudly to get their attention. They looked at him, but refused to let go of the hug. "I would recommend that you not return home tonight. Neutral territory sounds like a good idea since you'll have to do a lot of talking, and not just talking. I hope for the good. The Ramada is across the street, and they have reasonable room service and a full arsenal of complimentary toiletries." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and handed Bob 3 business cards. "These are respected and very successful consultants who specialize in building relationships, not in persuading people into divorce. They are highly recommended." He smiled fleetingly. "I do not receive any kickbacks and have no financial interest." He looked at Miss Anderson. "I will formally finalize this document as a postnuptial agreement and send it to Ms. Anderson's office for approval. She can let you know when everything is ready to sign." He took a deep breath. "I'm a lawyer, not a consultant, but I will say that you two have been through some really tough times. The euphoria and relief of avoiding an immediate divorce will pass, and there are some obvious issues that need to be addressed with love, patience, and understanding. So seek professional help as soon as possible and work on it. Work hard at it. I don't want to make any more money from your conflict, but I'm willing to provide drafting of wills, trust funds for children, and other similar services." He finished with a wry smile. The couple nodded, managed to stand up, and all shook hands. "At the Ramada?" asked Bob. Jennifer nodded. "I have a lot to catch up on, and the sooner I start, the better." They walked out of the conference room holding hands as their lawyers looked after them. "It was unexpected," Venus said, "but the best possible result." Steve sighed. "It was obvious that he still loved her. He was just so hurt that he had to retreat. I know she was repentant. In fact, she was one step away from committing suicide. Her parents were furious, and she knows that she has a very long probation period. To do something so thoughtless is egregious, but almost losing everything is extremely sobering." Steve looked at Venus directly with some determination. Personally, I think that once a deceiver, always a deceiver is too categorical. After all, if there is no such thing as redemption, what hope does the rest of us hopelessly flawed human beings have? He shook himself. Sorry, I was deeply immersed in philosophy. I haven't heard much about your practice, Venus said in a measured tone. Are you assessing the opposition? Steve grinned back. I admit that I haven't heard much about you either. They looked at each other like two samurai, professionally curious who will take the first step and how this step may end. Well, I have a freezer in my apartment full of microwave food and I want to celebrate. Would you like to join me for dinner? Of course, after carrying out all the necessary checks to avoid any manifestations of impropriety, he added. Venus laughed, carefully examining his open expression. Well, since I only have 3-day-old soup waiting to be reheated in my apartment, dinner somewhere else sounds good. Offers. Walker, Steve said immediately. Venus raised an eyebrow. I have not been there. It's relatively new, fairly quiet, has a varied menu, is quite reasonably priced, and, most importantly, is within walking distance. Show me the way. The Walker restaurant was everything it was advertised to be, and a respectable waitress with a calm smile and professional manner immediately ushered them to a quiet booth at the back of the room. I'm Marlene, and I will serve you. Where to begin? Steve raised an eyebrow at Venus, and she said, Homemade Chablis and a glass of water, please. Same thing, please, Marlene. So, tonight's specials are lobster bisque, crab rolls, Tuscan ratatouille, and lemon mousse with maraschino cherries and whipped cream. Be right back. They looked at each other for a minute. Two samurai, still fearful potential opponents. Steve's expression changed as he consciously decided to be vulnerable first. University of Pennsylvania. Cary Law School. Married Janice when she graduated from Perelman Medical School. First Memorial Hospital had her internship here, so we moved here. I wasn't looking for a partnership while she was interning, so I took what was left of my legacy from my parents and grandparents that got me through school and opened my own practice. It was difficult for him to read the rapid change of expressions that flashed across Venus's face when he said this, but he decided to continue regardless. Marlene quickly walked over, and 4 glasses were placed on the table, landing as light as feathers. I guess you need a little more time for the first courses. How about some snacks to soften the conversation? Steve chuckled. Do you like mozzarella sticks, Venus? Very rarely, but only with raspberry sauce. There was an expression of restrained amusement on her face. 2 orders of chopsticks, Marlene. Next, I'll take the marinara. Oh, Venus intervened. And separate checks, please, Marlene. Well, that's where I left off. Steve continued. Oh, yes, my practice was small, but successful. A lot of work. Many people couldn't afford big firms and didn't want to feel like they were numbered on a long list, but it allowed me to be at home, well, in the apartment when Janice wasn't on shift. He fed her, entertained her, and let her rest, and then sent her back into battle. At times, I imagined myself as a fighter's trainer, jumping up and down in the corner of the ring, forced to send my wife into the next round when the bell rang. The hospital is a regional trauma center and has gained some and lost some. I did my best. Being a doctor is exhausting. Being a doctor's support is also not so easy. He sipped his drink and gazed thoughtfully into the amber depths. You are divorced, aren't you? Venus suddenly spoke, and spoke with a confidence that would be disconcerting to others. There was a fleeting, sad look on Steve's face that began to turn into a wary look, but he tried to remain open. How can you know? There is no ring, and you are definitely the kind of man who will wear it. Wife is Janice, not Jen or some other form of endearment, and in the past tense. Yes. While I was at home working to save my marriage, there was a well-established, wealthy anesthesiologist who was persistently trying to find time with Janice at work. She completed her internship and was hired full-time. But at the celebration I planned to mark the end of her internship, I was served with a petition for divorce. She moved out that day. He served his wife that same day and moved out. They began to live together. Not wanting to have a fool as a client, I hired my own lawyer, Jack Hardesty. He was good and I learned some tricks from him, but it dawned on me that the law is not justice, but money. 2 plates of crispy golden brown sticks appeared on the table as if by teleport, courtesy of Marlene. "Still thinking about dinner?" she asked in an almost surprised tone. Steve twitched guiltily, opened the menu, grinned, and closed it again. "Actually, Tuscan ratatouille sounds intriguing. I think I'll try this." Venus grinned, opened the menu, glanced at the main course column, and said decisively, "I'll have shrimp with scampi, please." "Already on the way," Marlene assured them, and disappeared as unnoticed as she had appeared. "And?" Venus prompted surprisingly gently. "Oh, Janice promised not to claim that I emotionally abused her if I didn't ask for child support." We both made young professional money. But she made more. Jack tried to sue the hospital for not following their morals and non-fraternization policy, but was unsuccessful. "At all?" Venus asked in surprise. Steve shook his head. He tried. He tried very hard, but no one split. Ultimately, we could not prove that they had ever done anything on hospital grounds or at any official event, or anything else, period. No registrations in nearby motels, no recordings from CCTV cameras in places of probable meetings, no waitresses who served them during small, intimate dinners, and the hospital's position was that what their staff did in their free time was none of their business. Doctors, nurses, technicians, even hospital guards have a hard time in the hospital. In the end, Jack couldn't get anyone to admit in the slightest that they knew or even suspected that some kind of prank was going on. As much as anyone he talked to, or his private investigator talked to, would say it surprised the hell out of them when the 2 of them walked into the rescheduled party hand in hand, announced their engagement, and spent the evening dancing dirty on the dance floor. The anesthesiologist cut and cut off his wife, used the best divorce lawyer in the state, and proceeded to throw his wife and their small child overboard, to the point where she had to move back home to Oregon to stay with her parents and start over. There was a gloomy, significant pause. I, of course it turned out, had no idea what kind of woman I married. They deserve each other. Steve resisted the urge to gulp down his drink and took a sip instead. He had a firm rule, only 1 drink per event. He didn't need a reputation as a drunk. In fact, he hadn't gotten drunk since he graduated from pre-law school, and the night he was filed for divorce. He was alone in the conference room of the restaurant where he was throwing a party for Janice. No one showed up, except the processing server. Jack learned that day Janice told everyone invited that the location of the party had been changed, and Janice's relatives were also informed on the same day. According to later statements, staff were surprised when they were informed of an upcoming family carousel at another party. He was left with a lot of leftovers, a big bill, and an open bar with confused and sympathetic staff. They made sure he returned to his half-empty apartment and lay down in his empty double bed, with a bottle of champagne in a bucket of melted ice and rose petals dried and curled on the floor and blanket. He shook himself. The dark memories didn't help. The stabbing pain subsided, but the pain did not go away completely. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Venus said quietly, then ate one of her sticks to give him some time to recover. "Well, life goes on," Steve noted with a forced chuckle that sounded more like annoyance. "Business is going well. Life is a little lonely. Parents and grandparents are gone. An older sister and a younger brother, both out of state, are happily married and very closely associated with their families." He ate some of his snacks and then added dark humor. "I think my only nightmare is wondering if I'll get into an accident and end up on my ex-wife's operating table with her new husband as my anesthesiologist. Will she try extra hard to save me to avoid the embarrassment of not saving her ex-husband?" Or will she slip up a little to bury any nagging feelings that there is someone who knows what kind of person she really is? They finished their appetizers, and Steve noted that Venus was sipping her only drink and probably had her own rules, too. When the first courses arrived, Marlene invited them to enjoy them, cleared away the empty plates of appetizers, and left. There was an awkward silence for a minute or two as they examined their food and each other. So, Indiana University, Maurer School of Law. I went through it with honor and a huge debt. I moved here to take a position with Castor, Creamer, and Connors, and I immediately rushed into the fight for partnership. Long hours, late nights. I always strive to get ahead of other colleagues and am completely paranoid that they might get ahead of me. Steve decided to rely on his gut instinct. You are also divorced. Vena stared at her plate for a moment and then nodded reluctantly. Jimmy Fallon. High school students in love. We grew up together. Everyone thought we were perfect for each other. We thought so too. We studied at university together. I studied at the Faculty of Law. He studied at the Faculty of Construction. She got married when she graduated from law school. He graduated early with a master's degree and got a job at a very prestigious firm of architectural engineers. He was their golden boy. Oh. Immediately attracted the attention of the general director. He was great. While I was burning myself out trying to become a partner, he was a key player in several multi-million-dollar deals. He tried to support me like you supported your ex-wife, but I was always tense. I took it out on him. Whenever there was an event at his work, I would find an excuse to skip it and work harder. I later heard that his colleagues thought he had made me up because they had never seen him with his wife. But whenever there was an event at my work, I took him with me and showed him, and then spent a little time with him. Steve, somewhat alarmed, stopped eating and felt tense. Marlene scurried past, filled their glasses with water, and disappeared again. Venus let out a deep, deep sigh that ended with a slight tremble. You know the big law firms. They are extremely skilled at keeping their partner's carrot just out of reach, and I was determined. Several sessions with a therapist after that hinted that I was subconsciously competing not only with other colleagues, but also with Jimmy. I wanted to be at least as successful as him. And then one day I returned to the apartment, very late, as usual, and discovered that all his things had disappeared, and the ring was lying on top of the envelope with the divorce application. Finally, she looked up. I had a real spasm. And I'm ashamed to admit that my first thought was, how could he do this to me? Not, how could he do this to us? She shrugged. It turns out that while I was single-mindedly achieving success, Jimmy attracted the attention of the CEO's youngest daughter. I suspect the CEO saw this as the perfect opportunity to make sure the new golden boy didn't jump ship for greener pastures. I'm pretty sure they both, perhaps all of them, worked on it for 2 years, while I was emotionally, physically, and yes, largely sexually absent from what should have been my most important relationship. Knowing Jimmy, I'm pretty sure he didn't cheat on me before the divorce. I don't know if this should make me feel better or not. She picked at her food as if deep in thought, and Steve pondered the question as well. Unlike you, I was a fool as a lawyer. I was inadequate and determined to get Jimmy back. I wasn't going to let him make me look like a fool. I was a great lawyer, so I represented myself. The judge asked 3 times if I needed another lawyer, and the 3rd time, I was a little harsh and told her no. She looked at me with sad humor. Serious mistake. And I ran into Jack Hardesty. With your lawyer. Boss Jimmy pulled out the big guns. Oh, Steve exclaimed without even thinking. Among the city's family law circles, Jack was a real shark. Maybe not the biggest shark, but definitely in the great white shark class. Not that it did Steve much good at the time. Janice and that asshole did a great job covering their tracks. As far as any documentary evidence could tell, they had been just colleagues for several months, independently and completely by chance, decided to divorce their spouses on the same day, signed divorce papers at exactly noon, fell madly in love with a taxi on the way to a recently rescheduled party, and the second cousin just happened to have an empty apartment they could move into immediately. Probably an incredible coincidence. Venus didn't notice his little diversion into the booby-trapped memory area. I made all the rookie mistakes a lawyer can make. My goal was to get him back. I demanded consultation. I accused him of infidelity without any evidence, trying to put maximum pressure on him. I should have known him well enough to know that this would only make him bitter instead. The judge asked to see evidence, and I was forced to admit that I didn't have it, but it should be obvious, right? The judge was known to favor the woman, but we confirmed irreconcilable differences. I forgot Jimmy kept a diary. I couldn't remember a single date related to my family, and I only had vague memories of events other than work. When the judge asked me directly the last time I had a marital relationship with my husband, I couldn't remember and made an obvious wild guess of a couple of months ago. It was like a stake in a vampire's heart. Jimmy's diary revealed that it was 16 months ago. At this point, even my own mother turned her back on me. I guess it didn't help that I hadn't sent her a Mother's Day card, a birthday card, or a Christmas present in 2 years. Although Jimmy did it, the judge ruled that since I had shown no interest in family life before applying, there was nothing to show that I had changed or wanted to change, so counseling would be a waste of time. There was more, but in the end, the divorce was granted, and Jimmy left with his supporters. All I had left was my mom and dad, who were extremely disgusted with me. They weren't happy with Jimmy, but they were very unhappy with me. They both ate in silence for a few minutes, and then Venus sighed again. The fact that I was flattened in court had an effect, and I was kicked out of work. A few guys let me know that they would be happy to comfort me, but other than that, they weren't interested in anything. I felt very bad. I came home, lived in the family basement for a couple of months, talked to a therapist, came back and opened my own office. At first, I was determined to represent only abused women. It turned out that this eliminated 75% of my potential clients, and I couldn't afford it. And then I decided to represent the interests of only offended spouses. Well, it doubled my potential clients, but it still wasn't as many as I would have liked. So I compromised to represent whoever I wanted and try to get the best settlement for my client. She was silent for a moment, then quietly added, "That didn't stop me from feeling acutely worried about your client or feeling relieved about mine." Steve hadn't expected that statement, but he sensed that for some reason she felt safe and needed to get some things out that previously only her therapist could hear, so he remained respectfully and sympathetically silent. "Well, life goes on. Jimmy and Lisa are married. They have a beautiful little son and a daughter on the way, or so I heard," she added hastily. "And they are the perfect couple. He is probably the youngest millionaire in the city, and a wonderful guy." She raised her pain-filled eyes and swallowed. "And I have to live with the idea that if I had achieved what your client managed to achieve, I could live in a house with Jimmy hugging me at night, and a little guy screaming, 'Mommy!' and hugging my knees." She smiled at Steve, a sad, crooked smile. I probably shouldn't show a vulnerable side to a potential adversary in the courtroom. Lawyers are not opponents. We are representatives, mediators, supporters. I represent those who hire me to the best of my ability. I'm sure you think so too. Thank you. Then she smiled, genuinely smiled, like a patient after a chiropractor has adjusted his back and his nerves relax. "I don't think I've ever demonstrated a strategy today. Did you expect this to work?" "Oh, this? I call it Way of the Wolf, and I had high hopes. I know my client had desperately high hopes." "The Way of the Wolf? You mean the packs of furry, fanged, bloodthirsty predators that tear apart moose, reindeer, and the like?" she asked incredulously. He laughed, a quiet, charming laugh, and then nodded, and then shook his head. "This is one side, yes, but they are also fiercely loyal, dedicated pack hunters with a strict hierarchy, one for all and all for one. If a pack member insults or challenges the alpha, there are really only 3 possible outcomes. A big battle occurs and the challenger becomes alpha on the corpse of the previous alpha, or the challenger is killed. Or the challenger runs away and becomes a lone wolf. And finally, surrender. The criminal rolls over onto his back and surrenders himself to the alpha's complete mercy. Complete surrender. The final apology, 'My fate is in your hands.' An alpha can easily disembowel or rip out a throat, but usually it's just a throat or ear bite to show who's boss. The apology is accepted, and the pack continues to function. He took a sip of his drink, ignoring Venus's gaze. From the point of view of divorce, the way of the wolf is complete surrender, and can only be used in situations of complete trust. Full disclosure to the offended spouse, not the offended spouse himself, of course. How often did you use it? 17 times. And how did it work? 17 times. Her eyebrows almost disappeared under her hairline. Really? I find this very difficult to believe. You have to understand that I only use it in very specific circumstances. Yes? My client is an abusive spouse, and he must be completely convinced and convince me that his husband is a completely decent person who still has some good feelings for him, no matter how deeply they are buried. The final test of this occurs in the conference room. If the spouse's lawyer comes up with an offer that is entirely fair or even more than fair, then there is a chance, and I suggest that my client go down like a wolf. If the spouse's lawyer demands scorched earth, then there is no hope, and I have a second proposal in my briefcase that is almost identical to yours. So that's why your client reacted like that? She looked almost hopeful as she encouraged you to present your counteroffer. She muttered to herself all the way to the door of the conference room. Please let him offer a fair deal. Please, God, let him offer a fair deal. You are a good actor. I thought you were reluctant to submit this proposal. This is part of the strategy, not a lie, maybe a little theatricality. And I don't want a desperately hopeful spouse to have those hopes dashed. I guess this is sort of the final Hail Mary pass in family law. He chewed a little more, swallowing thoughtfully before continuing. My client should actually be willing to sign this offer. This offer is not a bluff or the start of negotiations. It must be an honest offer before God. I let them know that in order to show genuine good faith, they must sign it in advance. And if their spouse accepts it and signs exactly as proposed, they must be willing to sacrifice everything and live according to it. There are many people who could not or did not want to take the risk and went for divorce. My client signed today without hesitation. Heck, she was willing to volunteer to wear a titanium chastity belt and weld it to herself if that's what it took to get her husband back. She was devastated by what she had done. Personally, I think that bastard put some kind of drug in her drink. Not enough to knock her out or send her to seventh heaven, but enough to make her very susceptible to suggestion. By the third time, he was practically blackmailing her that he would tell her husband if she pushed him away. This was when the husband caught them. Of course, her husband was in no mood to listen, and she had no evidence, so that's how they ended up here. This could be considered a big risk, Venus suggested, seeming to pay attention to the plump shrimp, but actually enjoying his voice. The voice was rich and reeked of careful thought and complete intelligence. A snake oil salesman a century ago with a voice like that would have been a millionaire, but Steve was selling hope and truth. He was intriguing. Yes, that was the same word. Well, I don't even suggest that as an option if the spouse has committed a truly unforgivable sin. No matter what, repentant, he didn't seem to. What do you consider unforgivable? He shrugged, considered taking another drink for a moment, and rushed forward. If the offending spouse had a cold, calculating, long-term affair, especially with a friend or family member, if the offending spouse became pregnant by another man or another woman, became pregnant by him, if the offended spouse learned about the affair in a public and humiliating manner, if there were betrayal with several partners, if the offended spouse has recorded evidence that the offending spouse disrespected, demonized, spoke nasty things about him, desecrating the marital bed, if the offending spouse contracts an STD, especially one that is incurable or one that renders him infertile, if the abusive spouse saw the offending spouse perform sexual acts that the legitimate spouse was categorically denied, or the cheating spouse absolutely refused any physical affection during the affair. So these are pretty much marriage killers. Something like the asteroid that made the dinosaurs go extinct. If such a cheating spouse dictates his own proposal of total surrender, I will put it on the table, and the other spouse will decide what to do. I will submit a request for consultation if this is what my client insists on. I am their representative, not a judge, although I will always give my true and honest opinion that they are wasting their time. He sighed. This often happens if I represent an offending spouse who may end up very poor because of the prenuptial agreement. How many of those 17 simply signed, so that the perpetrators simply have to abide by such an agreement? 3. The other 14 made some changes to make it more balanced, and 2 of the 3 returned to amend the post-marital agreement. The third got divorced, then saw that she fulfilled the agreement humbly and without complaint, and remarried her on the first anniversary of the divorce. I'm glad that everything is working out for them. Really glad. She looked at him slyly. But how do you know I won't use it against you? You won't do this, Steve smiled. You cannot. What do you mean? The thing is, my particular strategy only works if both spouses are decent and, deep down, really want to find some way to stay together and get through this. He looked a little confused, but for some reason, trusting this woman, the opposing lawyer, seemed like the right decision. A couple of lawyers with whom I worked before, when they call to set up a meeting time, they casually remark that their client, the aggrieved spouse, will put a perfectly fair offer on the table, and I can offer my client, if he really feels guilty, but wants to get a chance at forgiveness at any cost, to try to make a counter-offer, complete and unlimited surrender. However, my client may not agree to take such a risk. Not that I approve of it, but in this case, the right path is first a divorce, and then a new love interest. Sometimes it can work out. Venus looked at him, looked as if she intended to look inside him and read the fine print in his soul. His answering gaze slid past her defenses and mental scars and penetrated inside. They both looked away at the same time with funny laughs and chatted about trifles for the rest of the dinner. As they stood at the entrance to the restaurant, ready to go their separate ways, Steve turned to Venus and said, "Oh, counselor, Way of the Wolf is in no way patented, copyrighted, or trademarked. Feel free to use it where you see fit." She smiled back. "Sincerely, I will do so. Thank you. See you later." They went in opposite directions, but after about 30 feet they both turned their heads to look behind them. They made eye contact, blushed and smiled slightly shyly, and then turned back and concentrated on not bumping into the other pedestrians. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. 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 Listening to the next one.